I can remember it like it was yesterday. The morning of Monday, June the 5th, 2017. You see, I stepped onto the elevator from the 4th floor to head down to the lobby of our headquarters building to head to our snack market. I wanted to grab a mid-morning cup of joe because, well, this was a big day. I had a big meeting on this Monday morning with my VP, and if you're like me and you love fashion, I had on my black jacket, you know, that special garment that you have in your closet that you wear on a big day when you need that extra boost of confidence. This was that day. And as I stepped out of the elevator into the lobby, heading into the snack market, I happened to glance down and noticed that my phone was ringing. It was on silent, but I caught the blinker. And it was my dad calling me. And well, that's no big deal. I was used to my parents calling in the middle of the day, and I'd pick up most of the times my mom and say, "Mom, I'm headed into a meeting, I'll call you back." And whenever I got that break throughout the day, if I got that break, I'd give her a call back. This day was different. On this day, when I answered that call, I heard something that I had never heard before. You see, my dad was on the other line, and I heard his low voice, almost inaudible, crying. Had never heard my dad cry before this day. And that cry turned into a yell as he repeated for me for the 3rd time what I heard him say the first 2 times, but couldn't wrap my mind around the words that were coming out of his mouth. "She's brain dead," he said. And that moment changed my life forever. Now let's fast forward back 3 months. It's March of 2017, and I'm living in Chattanooga, Tennessee with my husband, Joseph Cole, and we had just made a big transition. I mean, we were excited. We were relocating from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Midtown Manhattan for 2 amazing career opportunities. He was working for the largest architecture firm in the world, and well, I had finally made my transition from sales to marketing. And when I tell you it was a long road, it was a long road, but this was a new role, a new opportunity in the big city, and I was so excited. And not only was I excited, I like to call her my chief cheerleader. My mom was also excited. As she said to me, I vividly remember our phone calls, making plans for her to come to New York that summer and visit us. And well, as I was in this new experience, on this new team, in this new city, I was the only Black woman on the team. And those first 3 months in this new marketing role would be filled with reminders of what that often means. You see, for the last 5 years, McKinsey and Lean In have published a study on women in the workplace. In their most recent study in 2019, they shared that women's experiences are often shaped by other aspects of our identity. Women of color specifically, in addition to lesbian and bisexual women as well, often have more difficulties, by and large, than the experiences of all other women in the workplace. They go on to share that most notably, Black women often face even more barriers in the workplace. Barriers to career advancement, barriers related to support from our managers, and barriers relative to sponsorship versus other groups in the workplace. And well, in reading this data, I read it with a nod because, well, this information wasn't new to me. I learned in over 12 years in corporate America how to manage microaggressions. I got really clear about what it meant to keep that smiling poker face when on the inside you were boiling over by what you were hearing. I also learned what it meant to be in rooms as the only, and often as the youngest. And so these experiences weren't new. But this one experience that I had during my time was very new. You see, it was in those first 2 months after I'd moved into this new role in New York. There were 2 men that were really critical to my career during this time. Let's call the first one Caleb, and the second one we'll call Ryan. You see, Caleb and I had a really great relationship. He was one of my advocates. across my career. He was the one that would be speaking up for me positively in the rooms that I didn't have access to. He would be looking out for opportunities for career advancement for me, whether they were projects or actual promotions. Caleb and I had a relationship that was built on trust. Ryan and I had a slightly different relationship. You see, Ryan was my hiring manager for this new marketing role. And well, I experienced with him a situation where it wasn't built on trust. And in fact, in 2 months, Ryan made a call to Caleb to discuss how he was having a really hard time working with me. And so in a conversation that was the normal cadence with Caleb, he shared this information with me. And you see, this information sparked in me a real hunger to prove that I belonged in every room that I stepped my foot in. Catalyst is an organization that does research around women, one of the premier organizations for information on women in the workplace. And they list this idea of emotional tax, meaning that there's this heightened experience that oftentimes happens that's extremely emotional when you are different in a space. Particularly Black women or Black men in a workplace, it often can deplete your sense of well-being and can diminish the sense of psychological safety in the workplace. I was feeling all of these things as I set out to prove that I belonged on this team and in this space. This wasn't just my experience, but there are thousands of women that look just like me that have had similar experiences in the workplace. And we often call it a need to code switch. You may or may not be familiar with that language, but code switching simply involves embracing the dominant culture's vernacular among certain groups, say for instance your colleagues, and then switching to your more authentic vernacular when you're amongst groups where you can be your authentic self, i.e. maybe with your family and friends. And in today's current environment, we're noticing a lot of communications, a lot of letters and posts around diversity and inclusion in the workplace, which would make one think that perhaps all of this is new. All of this around cultivating a culture of inclusion must be relatively new. Well, in fact, diversity and inclusion has been around since the late 1960s. As a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a number of discrimination suits were filed as a result of this legislation, and thus the increase of a focus on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. From a retrospective study of corporate diversity trainings that was done by Rohini Anand and Mary Frances Winters of the Winters Group, to my recollection of being in a classroom at the Harvard Kennedy School with Iris Bonet, who is a Harvard professor and an expert in the study of equity and diversity as it relates to gender. There's much conversation around, do these diversity and inclusion trainings actually work? But there's one common thread amongst all of them, and it is this idea of cultivating a sense of belonging. That regardless of what talent looks like in the workplace, belonging has a strong correlation to commitment, motivation, and engagement in the workplace. And while companies across the country, senior leaders, and C-suite executives are still from the late 1960s to 2020 today trying to solve how do we cultivate a more inclusive culture in the workplace, I believe that we all play a role in this work. One of the many things that my grief journey has taught me is that from personal loss to professional loss, we have to get to a place where we perhaps think differently about resilience. When we think about resilience, we often think about the capacity to recover quickly or being able to bounce back. And not only do we think about resilience in this way, but we also champion and cheerlead resilience in this way. How fast do you bounce back from adversity? How quickly do you recover from loss? I believe perhaps we should consider redefining resilience. that the idea of bouncing back is actually a myth, that we don't necessarily bounce back into the same shape and form as we did prior to adversity. But perhaps we focus on learning, adapting, and growing through adversity. So today I want to talk to you and just share 4 ways that we can really think about leading with empathy and real resilience in order to cultivate a culture of inclusion. Now, when we think about this idea of psychological safety, I can remember in this same marketing role having a phenomenal experience of spending a week in Mountain View, California at Google. You see, Google in 2015 spent 2 years researching what does it take to actually have an effective team at Google. And there was one idea that rose to the top of all of the research, and that's this idea of psychological safety. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what exactly is psychological safety? Well, it's this belief that you will not be punished or humiliated for speaking your truth, or for questioning, having concerns, or bringing up mistakes. It's really about this sense of individuals feeling comfortable being vulnerable in a space. Building an inclusive culture starts with us. It starts with the individual. It starts with individuals and individual teams, creating cultures within those teams that foster psychological safety. So first, let's think about, as we are getting real about resilience, leading with empathy. When we think about empathy, empathy is really about our ability to step into the experiences and to take on the perspective of someone else. You see, empathy is not about us. It has very little to do with our beliefs. It has very little to do even with our experiences or our expertise. Empathy is about becoming more aware of those that are different from you, but moving from awareness to action, to making a commitment to connect and to cultivate a community that builds trust and fosters psychological safety. Leading with empathy is critical to getting real about resilience. Next, we have to reflect. Now, you see, prior to my grief journey, if you would have asked me how I was doing and I wasn't having a good day, I'd probably tell you I was fine. And any psychologist or therapist, as my therapist shared with me, Brittany, fine is not a feeling. We have to get comfortable creating brave spaces that allow people to express how they feel. And what I find, particularly in the workplace, especially with being a Black woman, is that oftentimes we associate this sense of tapping into how we actually feel with weakness. And so we have to be really intentional in getting real about resilience by first reflecting and creating those spaces. Next, I believe we have to evaluate. So once we say, okay, I'm more aware of how I feel, I've done that reflection, I've done some introspection. If I'm at the organization level, I've created a space that fosters that kind of transparent dialogue that's built on this sense of psychological safety. Then I want to evaluate. I want to ask, how is this impacting me? Because you see, it wasn't enough for me to say that, I feel a little let down. I feel a little betrayed that, well, Ryan thought it was okay to call Caleb to talk about me when we were having conversations about me in our one-on-ones. But I had to determine, what was that costing me? What was it costing me to code switch? What was it costing me to stay silent and to not express how that made me feel? What is a lack of inclusion costing you at your organization? Have you done the work to evaluate how this is impacting you? The next way that we get real about resilience is that we make the adjustment. Once we have taken the time to reflect, we've said, okay, I'm evaluating how this is impacting me. I want to accept the outcome and also determine a new action. You see, when I went back to work about 2 months after my mother's funeral, I said, all right, Brittany, you have a decision to make. You've done some reflecting, you've done some evaluating. At that time, I had some regrets about some decisions that I had made in an effort to prove that I belonged versus making other decisions relative to my personal life and my family. But I had to say, okay, how do I accept the outcome? This is where we are. And how do I then determine a new action? And I believe one of the best ways to determine your new action is to be what you need. In those months that I couldn't get back with Ryan, what I needed was transparency. What I needed was honesty. What I needed was to have an open and honest conversation about where we were, what he thought, and having the opportunity to respond to that. So I said, you know what? If that's what I need to be that. So I made that adjustment. I had that crucial conversation with my manager when I returned. And I believe that that is so critical that we make these adjustments as we are navigating forward with real resilience. Last but not least, and I'll say this one is my favorite, the L of getting real about resilience is that we have to lose the cape. As a Black woman in corporate America, listen, I was raised on this idea that you oftentimes have to work twice as hard to perhaps get half as much. So this idea of work ethic and proving yourself, and as my dad would often say growing up, the biggest room in our house was the room for improvement. I learned what it meant to be continuously improving. But I think in addition to that, we have to get to a place where we lose our cape, where we share the load, where we are, as Brené Brown says in her TED Talk, we become vulnerable because we recognize that vulnerability is about speaking truth. It's about courage. It's about not being comfortable, but it is definitely, as she says, not about weakness. So how are we getting real and being what we need as we share the load to get real about resilience? You see, it was taking this journey that really helped me to understand if I'm going to play a role in cultivating a more inclusive culture at my organization, it starts with me. And I'll leave you with this thought from my mother as I wear one of her favorite pieces, which is this blouse that I have on today for this very special occasion. Getting this work right isn't just about us. If she was here, she'd tell you it's about the next generation. Thank you.